Good morning. Today we're going to talk about Section 3, the Age of Jackson. So far we've covered everything this chapter leading up to this, and now we're going to talk about the Age of Jackson. Andrew Jackson's policies speak to the common people but violate Native American rights. This is different because in the world today, we judge people of a standard that's not our standard. Okay? It wasn't their standard. Some of the things Andrew Jackson did were evil by today's standards. Back then, most of them might have been considered the norm. But let me go on record as saying he was a pretty bad guy in many cases. But we'll talk about that later, and that's not what I'm here to give you an opinion on. But this is in the news today about taking down Andrew Jackson statues, places, and things like that. But we have to talk about history. We can't ignore history. So let's move on. All right. The Age of Jackson. Expanding democracy changes politics. Okay, in 1824, Andrew Jackson ran for president, but lost, even though he won the popular vote. Okay, John Quincy, there were 3 or 4 candidates, Henry Clay being one of them, and in the House of Representatives, when there's no majority, the election goes to the House of Representatives, and Clay struck a bargain with John Quincy Adams, who was John Adams' son, and Jackson called it the corrupt bargain. And Jackson actually split the Democratic-Republican Party over this. Goodbye, era of good feelings. Okay, and the Democratic-Republican Party, which was called Republicans at that time, split into 2 parties. The Democratic Party and the National Republican Party. Now the National Republican Party would die out. That's not the Republican Party of today. But the Democratic Party is still the Democratic Party of today. Democracy and citizenship. Most states eased voting qualifications after this election. People were mad about this election, especially in the South. And the South had been a holdout that only wanted property owners to vote. But after Jackson lost this election, they said, we've got to give every white male above the age of 21 the right to vote. That's another opportunity we're going to talk about later, but basically, the enslaved persons, people held in bondage, were not allowed to vote, and women were not allowed to vote. Okay, but all men over the age of 21 could vote. That would change it because they would come out big time for Andrew Jackson. In 1828, the election of 1828, all these new voters helped Jackson win the presidency. And I'm not skipping over the presidency of John Quincy Adams. We'll talk about that in a different theme later on. But Jackson was what we call a populist. And a populist is someone who pretty much feels the pulse of the people and does what the people want. We've had populist presidents before. Now, this is not the populist party. Many people would say that Bill Clinton was a populist. Donald Trump, definitely a populist. They motivate the masses, okay? President Obama, to a different way, may be a populist. But when you talk about populism in the latest presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, progressive populist, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, these are all examples of populist presidents. FDR, to a big degree as well. And I probably left someone out. All right. He claimed he was of humble origins, though in reality he was very wealthy. He wasn't born poor, but he did join the Revolutionary Army as a young teenager. He was the last president to serve in the American Revolution. He was captured. But he called Adams an intellectual elitist, and he won the presidential election of 1828 by a landslide. Now, that's one of the things that populist presidents often do. They paint other people as being elite. Hey, you don't want to vote for those guys. They're snobs. They're up here. They're super academics. I'm one of you. That's what populist presidents do. Populist candidates do. Okay. Now, he did limit appointees to federal jobs to 4-year terms. And he wasn't the first president, but he was the biggest at using the spoil system, which replaced former appointees with his own friends, whether or not they were qualified. Now, every president does this. But the thing about Jackson's, many of his were not qualified. His friends become his primary advisors, the kitchen cabinet. Every president has a cabinet, but Jackson's cabinet angered him early on, so he just started turning to his friends and meeting with them for the most part. Congress passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It's going to lead eventually to what's called the Trail of Tears, and we'll talk about that again in a later unit. But we will just discuss it a little bit here. The whites wanted to displace or assimilate Native Americans in mainly the Southeast. Okay. Jackson, who was both a huge enemy of the Native Americans, but was actually a very close friend to many of the tribal chiefs, said the only good thing for Native Americans is to give them their own land, their own place out west. That sounds great, but how would you feel if someone came in and said, look, we don't like you living in our neighborhood, we're going to move you somewhere else? What would your reaction be?
Angry.
Mine would be, this is my house. And my wife's would be like, hey, where are you going to move us and how much are you going to give us? But, and that's what a lot of people would be. And many of the Native Americans were that way. Yeah, we'll take the money and run. Because they gave them, acres out west and money to relocate with early on. Now, he said assimilation cannot work. The Indians are not becoming like us, quote unquote. So there's too many troops. They need to keep whites out of native lands. These funds, they fund treaties that force Native Americans west, and Jackson pressures some tribes to move and forcibly removes others. But resisting this were predominantly the Cherokee and the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes in the Southeast. Because they built plantations and had houses and had businesses. They were part of the community. They were the community. But gold was discovered in Dahlonega, Georgia. And at that time, on Cherokee land, the Georgia government said, we got to get them out of here where we can get this gold. The Cherokees fought back. In Worcester versus Georgia, they ruled that the state cannot rule the Cherokee or invade their land. The Supreme Court ruled this. They continued to fight. However, President Jackson, at that point, basically said, the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let's see him enforce it. And they relocated the Indians anyway. Many of them did choose to relocate, and those were called the Treaty Party. It's not going to go well for them after the Trail of Tears. Because when the other Native Americans get out to Oklahoma and Arkansas, they hunt these folks down, the leaders. Okay. Now, by 1838, 20,000 remained. By this time, Jackson is no longer in office, and President Martin Van Buren orders their removal. And that would become known as the Trail of Tears. And I'll do another segment specifically on the Trail of Tears, and we'll talk about that later. On the way, they were robbed by government officials, outlaws, and thousands died. One of the leaders on the Trail of Tears was a guy named Chief John Ross, who was 1/8 Native American, okay? But since he declared himself a Cherokee, he was forced to relocate too. And he was a multi-millionaire. And they didn't take all that money, but still it was not good. Here's an image of the Trail of Tears. Many were riding horses, but a lot were also walking as well. Here's a map of the Trail of Tears. You can see various routes. This one group of the creek actually went back up the Mississippi River, but the one where the most people died was the Trail of Tears here. This is the Cherokee from North Georgia and Northeast Alabama. Okay. Section 4, the age of Jackson.